Hit the like button, share your thoughts, subscribe, and tap the bell icon. The wreckage of the spaceship sprawled across the barren surface of the planet, its once pristine hull scarred by cosmic debris and the violent crash landing that had left it crippled. The orange dust of the desert-like terrain swirled around the twisted metal and scattered fragments, as if the planet itself was mourning the fall of a proud vessel. Among the wreckage, a solitary figure worked tirelessly, the figure of a human, his hands stained with grease and blood, his face a mixture of determination and exhaustion. Captain Adrian Hawke, a seasoned spacer, had been drifting in the vast emptiness of space when his ship had been ambushed by an unknown enemy. His crew had perished in the attack, and the ship had been left drifting until a malfunction sent it plummeting to the surface of the desert planet. Alone, and with no means of communication, Adrian had been left to face the silence of space and the harsh environment of an alien world. His ship was beyond repair, or so he thought, but his training, honed through years of spacefaring experience, wouldn't let him give up so easily. He had managed to salvage parts from the wreckage and, using whatever tools he had left, began the long, painstaking process of restoring the ship. His hands worked deftly as he patched the damaged systems, rewired the power conduits, and replaced the shattered components. He was no stranger to such work, but there was something different this time. The weight of loss, the absence of his crew, and the overwhelming solitude pressed down on him like an invisible force, making every movement feel heavier than before. As Adrian toiled, he barely noticed the presence of another, a being who had appeared from the shadows of the wreckage. She was tall and lithe, her skin shimmering with an iridescent hue, a color that seemed to shift with every movement. Her long, flowing hair cascaded down her back like a wave of liquid silver, and her eyes, deep pools of violet, locked onto Adrian with an intensity that sent a ripple of awareness through him. She was an alien, a woman unlike any he had ever seen before, her features both alien and mesmerizing. The woman stood quietly, watching him for a moment, before she stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm, breaking the silence. "You are injured," she said in a tone that was almost musical, a sound unlike any language Adrian had encountered. But somehow he understood. The tone, the cadence, the intent, he knew she meant no harm. Adrian paused, his hand frozen mid-repair, and looked up at her. His eyes narrowed in confusion and suspicion. How had she found him? Where had she come from? He didn't remember seeing anyone when he crash-landed. And yet, here she was, standing in front of him, as if she had always been there, watching, waiting. "I'm fine," Adrian muttered, pushing himself back to work. The last thing he needed was an alien trying to distract him. But she remained, undeterred, her gaze soft but insistent. "You are broken," she replied, her eyes never leaving his face. "Not just your ship, but you." Adrian bristled at her words. He wasn't broken. He couldn't be. He was a captain, a survivor. He had to be. His resolve, forged through years of war and battle, wouldn't allow for weakness, not even now. "I'm fine," he repeated, gritting his teeth as he tightened a bolt on the ship's engine. "Just here to fix my ship and get out of here. That's all." The alien woman tilted her head slightly, a subtle expression of understanding crossing her face. "The ship is not the only thing that needs repair," she said softly. "You cannot escape what you have lost." Adrian froze once more, her words sinking deep into his soul like a jagged shard of glass. It was true, he couldn't escape it. He couldn't escape the faces of his crew, their final moments replaying in his mind, their screams echoing in the darkness. Their deaths had been his fault, and no amount of repair work on the ship would ever fix the gaping wound in his heart. But he couldn't admit it. Not to her. Not to anyone. He stood up abruptly, brushing past her and heading toward the main control console of the ship. He had to focus on the task at hand. The repairs. The ship. His only way out of this hellhole. But the alien woman followed him, her presence as constant as the crushing weight of his grief. She didn't speak, but her eyes seemed to follow his every movement, studying him with a quiet intensity that was both comforting and unnerving. Adrian's hands shook as he worked on the console, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. He could feel her watching him, as though she were waiting for him to break, to collapse under the weight of everything he had lost. He couldn't let that happen. Not now. The sound of footsteps behind him brought him back to reality. He turned around, ready to snap at the woman for intruding, but the words died on his lips. She was kneeling now, her hands gently touching the broken parts of the ship, her fingers tracing the delicate wires and circuits. Her touch was almost reverent, as if she were performing some ancient ritual. "You repair not only the ship," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You repair yourself in the process." Adrian stood there, stunned into silence, watching as she continued her work. Her presence was a mystery, an enigma he didn't understand. But for the first time since the crash, he felt something shift within him. A sense of connection, a glimmer of something more than just survival. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the wreckage, Adrian realized that the ship might not be the only thing that needed fixing. The desert planet's twin moons hung low in the sky, their pale light casting a soft, ethereal glow over the wreckage of the ship. As the wind howled across the barren landscape, carrying the scent of dust and decay, Adrian Hawke continued his repairs under the watchful eye of the alien woman. He had expected her to leave him to his work, but instead, she had remained at his side, offering silent assistance that seemed to blend seamlessly with his own efforts. Her touch was light, almost imperceptible, as she moved across the ship's innards. She never spoke unless necessary, but the calmness she radiated seemed to infuse the air around her, making the mechanical noises of the ship less oppressive, less lonely. Every time Adrian's hands faltered or his mind wandered, she was there, just a few steps away, her presence grounding him, reminding him that he wasn't truly alone. It was strange, but he had begun to trust her, not in a way that he would have trusted a fellow human, but in a quiet, unspoken manner. Her gaze, those deep violet eyes, felt like they saw right through him, into the very heart of his pain. "Why are you helping me?" Adrian asked suddenly, his voice gruff with exhaustion. He hadn't meant to ask, but the question had slipped out, borne on a wave of frustration that he had been suppressing for hours. He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, smearing the grime across his brow. The alien woman paused in her work, her head turning slightly to face him. For a moment, she said nothing, but the silence stretched between them, comfortable yet heavy. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft, yet carrying a depth that seemed to resonate within him. "Because you need it," she said simply. Her words were calm, but there was an undercurrent of something ancient, something that carried wisdom far beyond the scope of mere words. "Not just the ship. You." Adrian stood still for a moment, his fingers still clutching the tools he had been using to tighten a circuit panel. He felt a strange warmth welling up in his chest, a sensation that both confused and comforted him. He had spent years aboard ships, surrounded by crew and comrades, always working toward something. Survival, success, victory. But here, on this lonely planet, his entire world seemed to have narrowed down to this moment, this woman, and the broken ship. Her eyes never left his, as if she were waiting for him to understand something that he hadn't yet grasped. Adrian shifted uncomfortably, feeling the weight of her gaze like an invisible hand pressing down on his chest. "I don't need help," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. He was starting to realize just how empty his words felt. The facade of self-reliance that had defined him for so long was beginning to crack. She moved closer, her steps light and deliberate, until she was standing just a few feet from him. He could feel the warmth of her presence radiating toward him, and for the first time since the crash, Adrian allowed himself to breathe, really breathe. "I've seen your kind before," she said, her voice soft but with a note of understanding. "So many of you, carrying the weight of your past, trying to fix what cannot be fixed. You build and rebuild, but you never heal." Adrian clenched his jaw, unwilling to let her words land. He had spent too long in space, too long fighting battles and running from his own demons to listen to some alien woman tell him that he was broken. But her words, however uncomfortable, made a part of him stir. There was a truth in them, one that he couldn't deny. "I don't need healing," he snapped, though he knew he was lying. "I need my ship fixed. Nothing else matters." Her eyes softened, and for a brief moment, Adrian thought he saw a flash of sadness in them. She stepped closer, her hand reaching out. At first, he flinched, instinctively pulling back, but she was persistent. Her touch was light, almost like a whisper against his skin, as she placed a hand gently on his arm. The touch was not cold, nor was it particularly warm. It was simply soothing. "You are not your ship, Adrian Hawke," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "You are not your past. You are more than the sum of your failures." He shook his head, looking away. "I'm not interested in philosophy. I need to get off this planet before I end up like the wreckage out there." Her eyes narrowed slightly, and for the first time, Adrian saw a flicker of something fierce in them. It was fleeting, but it caught his attention. She wasn't just some passive observer. There was strength in her, strength that had been honed through experience, just as his own strength had been. "You are not broken, but you are wounded," she said, the quiet conviction in her words making his heart skip a beat. "And wounds, no matter how deep, must be tended to, or they will consume you." Adrian was silent, his mind racing. He had been running for so long, running from the deaths of his crew, running from the mistakes he had made. He hadn't been able to face the truth, that he wasn't invincible, that he wasn't some indestructible force. He was human, fragile, vulnerable, and that made him dangerous both to himself and to those around him. The alien woman didn't push him further. She simply stood by, her hand still resting lightly on his arm, offering no judgment, only understanding. It was in that moment that Adrian realized something he had been unwilling to admit for years. He couldn't repair the ship alone, just as he couldn't repair himself alone. Perhaps it wasn't just the ship that needed fixing. Perhaps, in some strange way, this alien woman had come to show him that he wasn't meant to survive in isolation, that no one could truly heal without help, without connection. The night had deepened, and the two figures, one human, one alien, continued to work in a rhythmic silence beneath the pale glow of the twin moons. The wreckage of the ship stood like a silent monument to the fragility of life, its broken pieces scattered across the planet's surface. The repairs were progressing, albeit slower than Adrian had hoped. His mind had been fractured, his concentration disturbed by a constant inner noise he couldn't shake. The alien woman, whom he had only just met, had begun to unravel something inside of him, something that he hadn't known needed healing. The quiet hum of the ship's remaining power systems filled the air, mingling with the wind's distant howl across the empty desert. Despite the occasional thrum of machinery, everything felt as though it was suspended in time, as if the very planet itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. "Why are you really here?" Adrian asked again, this time his voice softer, almost questioning. His eyes remained focused on the panel in front of him, but he could feel her presence, unwavering at his side. She hadn't offered much about herself. No name, no history. Just quiet assistance and an unspoken understanding. The alien woman didn't answer right away, and Adrian thought for a moment that she might have chosen to ignore him. But then, as her fingers brushed against the control console with delicate precision, she spoke. Her voice was barely audible above the hum of the ship, but each word felt like it had been carefully chosen. "You are not the first human I have met," she said, her voice steady, even. "I have encountered others like you, stranded, broken, and lost. I have helped them too, in my way." Adrian didn't look up. He didn't want to. But the curiosity that had been growing within him compelled him to ask, "And what happened to them?" Her gaze was distant for a moment, as though she were searching through memories that spanned eons. "Some left," she said, her voice taking on a reflective quality. "Some never recovered, and some disappeared." A chill ran through Adrian at the last word. Disappeared. What did that mean? Had they simply died? Or had they given up? The uncertainty gnawed at him, but he didn't voice his fears. "Not yet." "I don't need saving," Adrian said quickly, more to himself than to her. He hated how fragile his voice had sounded, how vulnerable it had become. The alien woman turned to him, and for the first time, he saw something akin to compassion in her eyes. "You are right," she said softly. "You don't need saving. But sometimes, even the strongest of us need help to mend what is broken." Adrian shook his head, the weight of his past suddenly settling like a heavy stone in his chest. "I've done enough of that. Fixing things. Fixing people. Trying to make it all work. But this time, I don't even know if I can." He wasn't sure what came over him, whether it was exhaustion, the toll of being so utterly alone, or the weight of the alien woman's presence. But in that moment, the dam that had held his emotions in check for so long began to crack. The memories of the battle, the ambush, and the screams of his crew flooded back. The sound of metal ripping, the fire that had consumed the bridge, the cold feeling in his chest as he tried, helplessly, to save them all. He had failed, and that failure had carved a deep wound in his soul that no amount of repairs, no amount of work, could ever fill. "I failed them," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Yet the words felt like a confession long overdue. The alien woman was silent for a long moment, her eyes never leaving his face. There was no judgment in her gaze, only an understanding that made his insides twist. She reached out, her hand moving toward his, offering a touch of comfort. This time, Adrian didn't pull away. "You carry the burden of their loss, but you are not the cause of it," she said quietly, her voice low and soothing. "There is no shame in mourning. There is only strength in how you carry it." Adrian clenched his fists, the grief threatening to overwhelm him once again. He had tried to bury it for so long, to compartmentalize it and shove it into some distant corner of his mind where it wouldn't hurt him anymore. But the alien woman's words, so simple, so honest, had cracked open that carefully constructed wall, leaving him exposed, vulnerable. "I don't know how to live with this," he admitted, his voice raw. "I don't know how to move forward when everything I touch seems to fall apart." She knelt beside him then, her presence as unyielding as the desert winds. Without saying a word, she gently placed her hand on his chest, directly over his heart. Adrian flinched, instinctively trying to pull away, but she was persistent. Her touch was firm, yet gentle, an anchor in the storm of his emotions. "You do not have to move forward alone," she said softly, her words like a balm on his tortured soul. "There is healing in connection, in understanding, and though you feel lost now, I am here to guide you." Adrian looked at her then, truly looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. Her eyes were deep and wise, filled with a knowing that he couldn't quite understand but could feel deep within himself. It was as if she had seen the darkest parts of him, the parts he had hidden away from even himself, and accepted them without question. The ship, the desert, the wreckage, they all seemed so distant in that moment. Nothing seemed as important as the stillness they shared. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was the kind of silence that spoke volumes, that allowed Adrian the space to breathe and just be for once. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice quieter than before, almost a whisper. The alien woman smiled faintly, the expression lighting up her face in a way that made her seem almost human, despite everything that set her apart. "My name? It is not important," she replied softly. "But you may call me Lyra." Lyra. The name felt right, as if it belonged to her, resonating like a song he had never heard but instantly recognized. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Adrian allowed himself to relax. The weight of his past didn't feel as heavy, not with her there. It didn't feel as though the burden of the world was solely on his shoulders anymore. The days that followed felt different, subtly changed. The ship was slowly coming back to life. What had once been a crippled wreck, its systems offline and its hull ravaged, was now showing signs of repair. Adrian and Lyra worked side by side, but now there was an unspoken understanding between them, an unacknowledged bond that seemed to transcend the practicalities of survival. Every time Adrian faltered, whether in physical work or in his emotions, Lyra's presence was a steady force beside him, and each time, she offered no advice or solution. She simply allowed him the space to heal, to work through his brokenness in his own time. "Adrian," for the first time since the crash, found that he wasn't dreading each new day. The gnawing emptiness that had plagued him for so long, the grief he had carried like an invisible weight, began to feel less like a prison. It was as if the simple act of working alongside someone who understood his pain without needing to hear the full story, was beginning to change something deep within him. He wasn't fixed yet, not by a long shot, but he was beginning to see that there was more to life than just surviving. That evening, as the twin moons hung like silent sentinels over the desert, Adrian sat on the ground, his hands caked in grease, his body weary but satisfied with the progress they had made. The ship was nearly operational again. Just a few more tweaks, and they could leave this planet behind. But despite the mechanical progress, something else gnawed at him. His mind wouldn't let go of the questions that had been circling him since his encounter with Lyra. "What are you really looking for?" he asked, his voice breaking the quiet that had settled between them. He hadn't meant to speak the question aloud, but it had been simmering in the back of his mind for days. Lyra was a puzzle. She was here on this barren world, helping him, guiding him through the quiet agony of his past. But why? What was her true purpose? Was she a wanderer like him, or did she have some deeper reason for being on this planet? And more importantly, why had she chosen to stay by his side, offering him nothing more than the quiet, persistent company of someone who knew what it was to be broken? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she kept working on a damaged wiring panel, her hands moving fluidly, almost gracefully. Adrian waited, his gaze fixed on her, wondering if she would offer him some cryptic answer. Finally, she paused, her fingers lingering on the wires as her gaze met his. There was a quiet sadness in her eyes, a depth that seemed to stretch far beyond the boundaries of the desert planet. "I am not like you," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of untold stories. "I am not human." Adrian nodded, the statement hardly surprising. Of course she wasn't human. He had known that since the moment he first laid eyes on her. What he didn't understand was why she had come to help him, why she had chosen to remain at his side when she could have easily left him to fend for himself. "You said you've met other humans," he pressed. "What happened to them? Why didn't they stay? Why aren't they here now?" Lyra's fingers tightened around the wires for a moment, as if the question had reached somewhere deep inside her. Her face softened, a trace of regret crossing her expression. "Some stayed for a while," she said, her voice tinged with a weariness that matched his own. "Some, like you, needed healing. But in the end, they all left. Some in peace, others, not so much." Adrian frowned, trying to piece together the fragments of her words. "What do you mean, not so much?" Lyra's gaze fell, her fingers brushing against the ship's hull absent-mindedly. "Some come to this planet seeking something. Some come to fix their brokenness, or to escape their pasts. But in the end, they all want to leave to return to their lives. They don't realize that what they carry inside, what they refuse to confront, doesn't go away. It follows them." Adrian's heart twisted, her words striking too close to the truth. He knew what she meant. He had tried to outrun his own demons, to escape the memories of his crew, the guilt that ate at him every day. The idea of leaving this planet, of finally putting the past behind him, had been his sole focus. But in the back of his mind, a seed of doubt had begun to grow. "What happens when they leave?" he asked, his voice tight with the need to understand. Lyra's eyes softened, and she took a deep breath. "Some heal. Some go on to live their lives, carrying the lessons they learned. But others, they carry the same brokenness they had before, and it festers. It becomes a poison that seeps into everything they do, and eventually, they destroy themselves." Adrian swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her words. They were more than just a warning. They were a truth that he had already seen in his own life. He had been running, he had been avoiding the inevitable reckoning with his past. But no matter how far he went, it would always follow him. Just like the wreckage of his ship, just like the faces of his fallen crew, just like the guilt. Lyra's voice cut through his thoughts. "You cannot outrun what you have lost, Adrian. But you can choose how you carry it." Adrian's hands clenched at his sides, his mind reeling. He had been so focused on fixing the ship, on getting off this planet, that he hadn't stopped to consider what it would mean to truly leave. He had never allowed himself to confront the grief, the guilt, or the shame that had shackled him for so long. "I can't fix it," he said softly, the words coming out before he could stop them. "I can't fix what's inside me, no matter how much I try." Lyra's gaze remained steady. "That's not what healing is, Adrian. Healing is not about fixing. It's about understanding, accepting." He looked at her then, his heart pounding in his chest, as if he were standing at the edge of a precipice, unsure whether to jump or turn back. But in her eyes, he saw something he hadn't allowed himself to see in so long: hope. "You've done something for me," Adrian said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've made me feel like maybe I'm not beyond saving." Lyra smiled softly, her gaze never leaving his. "You are not beyond saving. But first you must save yourself." And in that moment, Adrian realized that the repairs to the ship were only part of the journey. The real work, the work that would determine if he could ever truly move forward, lay within himself. The air was cooler now, a light breeze sweeping across the wreckage of the ship as the twin moons bathed the desert in their silver light. Adrian stood before the damaged hull, his hands resting on the cool metal. The sound of the ship's slowly recovering engines hummed in the background, a comforting reassurance that they were close, so close to leaving this forsaken planet behind. Yet, as much as the ship was being restored, Adrian's mind was still fractured, still caught in a web of memories he had been unable or unwilling to escape. The conversation with Lyra had lingered in his thoughts, echoing through the quiet hours as he worked. He couldn't shake the truth of her words. Healing is not about fixing. That had struck him harder than anything in years. He had spent so much of his life trying to fix everything: the wreckage of ships, the fractured lives of his crew, and his own heart. But in his relentless pursuit of perfection, he had never stopped to consider that maybe there was no fixing it. No amount of repairs, no amount of work could erase the past. But Lyra, she had seen beyond that. She had seen what was broken in him, and rather than offering a solution, she had offered something more valuable: acceptance. It wasn't about making him whole again. It was about letting him acknowledge the fractures, the pain, and to simply exist within it, without pretending it didn't matter. The more Adrian thought about it, the harder it became to reconcile the man he had been with the one he was now. He had been a soldier once, a leader among his crew, a man who had always been in control, who had always known what to do. But since the crash, since the loss of his crew, he had been adrift. He hadn't known who he was without the mission, without the orders, without the camaraderie. All of that had been ripped away from him, leaving behind only fragments of the man he used to be, the man who had failed. Lyra's voice broke through his spiraling thoughts. "You're ready," she said, her tone quiet but firm. He looked over at her, standing a few paces away, her posture relaxed but alert. She had always been this way, calm, unwavering, as if the world itself had no power to unnerve her. Adrian raised an eyebrow, unsure of what she meant. "Ready for what?" "Ready to leave this planet," she replied. "Your ship is nearly whole again. You've done what you can, and it's time to go. But you're still carrying something with you." Adrian let out a long breath, looking down at the ground. He knew what she was talking about. There was no escaping the truth. He had been carrying the past, his guilt, his regret, every decision that had led him here. And no matter how far he traveled, it would always follow him like a shadow. He had never truly left it behind. "I can't," he said, his voice tight with the weight of his emotions. "I can't just leave. I'm not ready." Lyra stepped closer, her presence as steady and grounding as the desert itself. "You're not ready to leave this planet, perhaps, but you are ready to leave the past behind. The ship will carry you far, but only you can choose where your heart goes." Adrian clenched his jaw. He hadn't known how badly he needed to hear those words until they came. There had always been a part of him, deep down, that had believed that leaving would somehow fix everything. If he could just get away from the memories, if he could just outrun the guilt, he might be free. But Lyra had been right. Running wasn't the answer. He had to face it, to accept it, to finally reckon with the choices he had made and the people he had lost. "You've told me a lot about how to move forward," Adrian said, his voice quieter now, the frustration in his tone replaced by something deeper, something more contemplative. "But I'm still not sure I understand. How do I let go of the past? How do I forgive myself for what happened?" Lyra's gaze softened. "Forgiveness is not about erasing what you've done. It's about understanding that you are not defined by your mistakes. You are defined by your choices now and in the future. What you choose to do with the pain, with the loss, that is what will shape you." Adrian swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her words press down on him. He had always thought of forgiveness as something that came after, something that would be given to him once he made amends. But now, as he stood before Lyra, as he looked into her patient, knowing eyes, he understood that forgiveness wasn't a destination. It wasn't a thing that could be earned. It was a process, a choice, and it was something only he could give himself. "I've been so focused on what I've lost," he said, more to himself than to her. "I never stopped to consider what I could still give, what I could still do." Lyra nodded, her expression thoughtful. "That is the first step. You've carried the weight of loss for so long, but now it's time to carry the possibility of healing. Not just for you but for others. For the future." Adrian looked back toward the ship, the nearly repaired vessel now gleaming in the moonlight. It had been his only focus for so long. But now, as he gazed at it, he realized that it was just a tool, a means to an end. The real journey wasn't about escaping this planet, this wreckage. It was about returning to life with purpose, about choosing to build something from the fragments of his past, something that wasn't defined by what he had lost. The past was a weight he would always carry, but it didn't have to break him. And with Lyra's quiet strength beside him, he could face it. "Thank you," Adrian said, his voice thick with emotion, "for staying, for helping me see that I don't have to keep running." Lyra gave him a small, soft smile. "I have not done much. You've always had the strength within you. You simply needed to see it for yourself." Adrian felt a lump rise in his throat as he realized just how much she had given him. Not answers, not solutions, but the courage to face the truth, no matter how painful. He wasn't whole yet, not by a long shot. But he was on the path, and that was enough. He turned toward the ship, his hand resting on the hull. The ship was nearly ready, and he was nearly ready. He wasn't running anymore. And wherever the future took him, he would carry the lessons of this journey with him. The ship's engines thrummed softly in the background, their rhythmic pulse now a steady, reassuring hum. Adrian stood at the threshold of the vessel, his hand on the cold metal, feeling the power beneath it. The repairs were finished. The ship was as ready as it would ever be to leave this planet. But as he looked over the barren desert stretching out before him, something inside him hesitated. Lyra was beside him, her presence grounding, but her silence was almost more powerful than any words could have been. She had helped him rebuild the ship, yes, but she had also helped him rebuild something much more fragile: his resolve. Her lessons had led him to this point, yet Adrian wasn't sure whether he was truly ready to leave it all behind. He had spent the last several days wrestling with his inner turmoil, with the fragments of his past that clung to him like shadows. Lyra had taught him so much about healing, about acceptance, but now he was faced with the most important question of all. Where did he go from here? How did he live with the past he couldn't change, while also walking forward into an uncertain future? His gaze turned to the distant horizon, where the twin moons glimmered faintly against the darkened sky. The planet had become a part of him, not just because it was his only refuge, but because it was here, amidst the desolation, that he had begun to face the pieces of himself he had long tried to bury. He couldn't escape that truth, nor did he want to anymore. "You've spent days thinking about it." Lyra's voice broke the silence, her tone soft but knowing. "What are you waiting for?" Adrian turned to her, surprised by the question. She had always been patient, a quiet observer, but now, there was a glint of urgency in her eyes. She had done her part. She had shown him the way. It was up to him now. "I'm not sure," Adrian admitted, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "The ship's ready, and I know I should leave. I know I should start moving forward. But it feels like there's something here I'm not done with. Something I need to face. Lyra studied him for a long moment, her eyes steady and calm. This planet won't heal you. It never could. The lessons you've learned here, the strength you've gained, they don't belong to this place. They belong to you. To your future. Adrian swallowed hard, her words sinking deep into his chest. He had spent so long focusing on the brokenness of his past that he had almost forgotten how to dream of the future. The ship was ready, yes, but so was he. He didn't need this planet anymore. He didn't need to keep running from his past, from the weight of his guilt. It was time to choose to live again. I thought leaving would mean escaping, Adrian said quietly. I thought if I just ran far enough, if I just got far away from all of this, that it would stop haunting me. But it never did. Lyra nodded. You cannot outrun what is within you. You can only face it, and choose to live despite it. He looked down at his hands, the hands that had tried so many times to fix what was broken, to make things right, and yet had failed. The hands that had carried the burden of his crew's deaths. The hands that had been too scared to touch anything real, for fear of causing more destruction. But now those hands were steady. They had helped repair the ship, and more importantly, they had helped repair something within him. I've been afraid of what I might find, of what might happen if I let go of the past. He said, almost to himself. I've been afraid that if I stop running, if I stop hiding from it, I'll fall apart. I'll shatter. You won't shatter, Lyra said, her voice firm. You might break again, but you won't shatter. Not this time. You are stronger than you believe. You are more whole than you think. Adrian exhaled slowly, absorbing her words. For the first time, he felt a flicker of something resembling peace. It wasn't an answer, but it was a step, a recognition that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to carry everything alone anymore. Maybe he didn't have to face it in isolation. I've spent so much time thinking that I needed to fix myself, Adrian said, his voice low, trying to find a way to be whole again. But I've learned that there's no fixing. There's only living with what's broken. Lyra stepped closer, her presence both comforting and empowering. You're beginning to understand. You have the power to decide what comes next. What matters is the choice you make now. You can't control the past, but you can choose how to shape your future. The words settled over him like a warm cloak, soft and steady. For the first time in a long while, Adrian felt like he could breathe. It wasn't about fixing the past. It wasn't about finding some grand resolution. It was about accepting what had been and moving forward with the strength of those lessons. I think I'm ready, Adrian said. His voice stronger now, more certain. He looked at Lyra, his gaze steady. I'm ready to leave, to stop looking back. She smiled at him, the faintest glimmer of approval in her eyes. Then go. You don't need this place anymore. But remember, wherever you go, you carry what you've learned. Carry the strength of your choices with you. Adrian took one last look at the wreckage of the ship, the place that had nearly destroyed him, and then looked to the horizon beyond. He didn't need to fix the ship to find his way forward. The journey had never been about repairing anything but himself. He had already begun that work. Turning toward the ship, he moved with purpose, his steps firm as he approached the cockpit. Lyra followed him, her presence a quiet but steady force at his side. Without looking back, Adrian climbed into the cockpit, settling into the familiar seat that he had once thought would be his tomb. His hands hovered over the controls for a moment. The engines hummed steadily beneath him, ready to carry him far from this place. But the true journey had already begun. It wasn't about the ship. It wasn't about escaping the past. It was about moving forward, knowing that the pieces of himself he had once thought irreparably shattered were now woven into the fabric of who he was. He punched in the coordinates, and with one final breath he released the brakes. The ship rumbled to life, its engines roaring as the ship lifted into the air. As the ground disappeared beneath him, Adrian felt something new stir within him. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was the beginning of it. The past would always be a part of him, but he would no longer be defined by it. He had made his choice, and for the first time in years, Adrian finally felt free. Thank you, Lyra, he whispered, The words meant only for her, though he knew she didn't need them. The ship soared through the starry expanse, the vastness of space unfolding before Adrian like a canvas yet to be painted. The desert world below had already faded into the distance, its lifeless sands swallowed by the dark of space. For the first time in years, Adrian felt something he had almost forgotten. Hope. It was a strange, fragile thing, like the first rays of sunlight peeking over the horizon. But it was there, glowing faintly in the corners of his mind. As the ship navigated through the cold void, Adrian's thoughts drifted back to Lyra. She had stayed by his side when he needed someone, when the weight of the world seemed unbearable, and she had never asked for anything in return. Her words had always been simple but profound, guiding him back from the precipice of despair. "I'll carry it with me," he whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. The past wasn't gone, not by a long shot. He still carried the grief, the guilt, and the memories of his fallen crew. But now, he knew that those things didn't define him. They were a part of his story, but they didn't dictate the ending. He could choose to move forward, to live in the face of them, and that was what mattered. Lyra's presence on this journey had been a gift, a light in the darkness. He wasn't sure where she had gone after they had left the planet, but he knew that her part in his story had ended for now. She had given him the courage to face himself and the strength to start anew. She had shown him that healing was a process, not a destination, and that it wasn't about forgetting the past, but learning to carry it with grace. Adrian's fingers hovered over the ship's controls as the engine hummed steadily beneath him. He could feel the hum of life within the ship, just as he felt the pulse of life within himself. It was a delicate balance, one he wasn't sure he would ever fully understand, but for the first time he felt like he was in control. He had been running for so long, never knowing what he was running from. Now he understood. He had been running from the truth, from the pain of losing his crew, from the guilt that had twisted inside him. But it wasn't the running that had broken him. It was the refusal to face the truth, to accept that he could never undo the past. It was the fear of facing the brokenness within himself. The stars outside the cockpit window seemed to blink, distant and cold, yet full of promise. Adrian had always seen the universe as a vast, empty space, a place where there was no meaning beyond survival. But now it felt different. He was no longer a lost soul drifting in the void. He was a man with purpose. And as the ship accelerated toward the unknown, Adrian knew that whatever lay ahead, he was ready. A soft beeping interrupted his thoughts. He glanced down at the communication panel, noticing that it was flashing with an incoming message. The display was cryptic, with no source or sender listed. Adrian hesitated for only a moment before reaching out to accept the transmission. The screen flickered, and a distorted image appeared before him. The signal was weak, the face on the screen blurry and difficult to make out. But Adrian immediately recognized the voice. "Adrian," the voice said, rough and strained, but unmistakable. "Can you hear me?" It was a familiar voice, one he hadn't heard in what felt like an eternity. His heart skipped a beat as the image on the screen cleared, revealing a face he knew all too well. It was one of his former crew members, someone who had been lost when the disaster struck, someone he thought was gone forever. "Jack?" Adrian's voice faltered as the shock of recognition hit him. "How are you? How are you alive?" Jack's face flickered again, his image warping as the signal continued to break up. We were stranded. There was a crash similar to yours, and we didn't have the resources to fix our ship. But we've survived. We've been searching for you." Adrian's mind raced. His breath caught in his chest as the realization hit him. His crew, the ones he had thought were gone, were still out there. He had believed he was the sole survivor of the wreck, the last of a broken crew. But now there was a chance, maybe a slim one, that he wasn't alone. That he wasn't the only one who had been forced to rebuild from the ruins. "Where are you?" Adrian asked urgently, trying to focus through the shock and the adrenaline surging through him. "We can help you. I can come to you. Just tell me where you are." Jack's face flickered again, the signal crackling with static. "We don't have much time. The ship, it's not going to last long. But we've located you, Adrian. We've been tracking your signal for days. You're not as alone as you think. Adrian's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the screen. This was it. The moment he had been waiting for. A chance to reconnect with the past. A chance to rebuild the crew that had been lost to the stars. But it wasn't just the past he had to face. It was the future, too. The crew had survived. But what had they become in the years since the crash? Had they moved on? Or were they still lost like he had been? Adrian. Jack's voice broke through his thoughts. Urgent. I need you to come. We're not going to make it without you. Adrian felt his pulse quicken. His hands tightened on the controls. This was the choice he had been waiting for. The chance to leave behind the wreckage of his past and step into something new. He had already begun his journey of healing. And now the universe had thrown him a lifeline. His crew was out there, waiting. With a deep breath, Adrian set a new course. The ship's thrusters responding with a surge of power. The stars stretched out before him, infinite and mysterious. But for the first time, they didn't seem so cold. They were full of possibilities. Possibilities he was ready to explore. Hang on, Jack, Adrian whispered, his grip steady on the controls. I'm coming. As the ship veered off into the depths of space, Adrian's heart swelled with something new. Not just hope, but the promise of redemption. He wasn't alone. And now he knew that no matter how broken he had been, no matter how many pieces of himself he had thought lost forever, there was always a way forward. There was always a chance to heal, to rebuild, and to live again. The end. Thanks for watching, everyone. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stellar HFY content. Ring that bell to stay updated, and we'll see you next time.